Hello, and thank you for joining us and welcome to Colorado Conversations. I'm Vince Bizdeck, Executive Editor of the Denver Gazette, Colorado Springs Gazette, and Colorado Politics. A short note about the Denver Gazette. We are singularly focused on delivering objective local journalism, a crucial component we feel of a free society and essential to a healthy democracy. We believe in accountability journalism that pursues the truth and empowers readers to make their own decisions. And we're committed to informing the residents of Metro Denver, our community, about the issues that affect their daily lives. If you have not yet, please consider subscribing. We have a big subject this morning. Nearly 4,000 immigrants have arrived in Denver from the border with Mexico since early December, and the city has spent more than $3 million to address this crisis. Why are so many immigrants coming to Denver now? Should Colorado keep its door open to immigrants? Do border policies need to change? We have a great panel today to help us wrestle with these questions. Joining us are Atim Oti, who's representing the City of Denver and the Denver Office of Emergency Management. Atim is the Director of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs Office for Human Rights and Community Partnerships. We also have Professor Violeta Chapin, who teaches the Immigration Defense Clinic at the University of Colorado Law School in Boulder. She and her students represent immigrant clients in a wide variety of legal matters, and Professor Chapin regularly lectures on matters related to immigration policy, including our border policies and immigration reform. Laura Lunn is the Director of Advocacy and Litigation at the Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network, where she represents people fleeing persecution and torture before the immigration agencies and federal courts. Nico Brambola, a health and education reporter specializing in investigations for the Denver Gazette, has written extensively on immigrants and immigration issues in Colorado, Texas, and California. So I'd like to just jump right into it. We'll give the panelists a minute at the end to wrap up their thoughts, but we'll get right to the questions right away. Let me remind the audience that they can ask questions themselves through the Q&A function or the chat function at the bottom of their screens. And we'd love to hear from your questions. We'll try to get to those questions about halfway through our show today. We're here for 1 hour. So let's jump right into it. Violeta, I'd like to start with you. Can you describe the situation at the U.S.-Mexico border? Why are so many coming across the border without authorization right now?
Well, one of the reasons why people arrive at the border without lawful ability to enter is because the United States makes it very difficult for people to come to the United States lawfully. And so we're seeing sort of record numbers of migrant movement across the globe, right? Not just here in our country, but in other places around the world. We're seeing a large number of people on the move for a wide sort of a number of reasons, right? There are wars going on, there's economic instability, there's just escalating violence in certain countries that are causing parents and families to move. And so the United States is part of the world, and we're seeing numbers of people showing up attempting to flee those dangerous conditions and looking for safety and refuge here in the United States.
So you mentioned that there's a lot of different reasons people come: to escape prosecution, avoid violence, escape famine or starvation, or seek a better life. Are there differences in these categories of people and how the U.S. treats them based on their situation? That is, an economic migrant is not the same as a person whose life is in danger in their country.
Well, certainly, right. Well, we have an asylum process here in the United States, which has been here with us for many years, and I'm grateful for that. Certainly, in order to win asylum in the United States, you need to be able to show evidence of either past persecution or future persecution should you be returned to the country where you are. And typically, economic migrants are not necessarily going to fall within the asylum process to the extent that they need to prove persecution. But each person has their own individual story, and there could be a reason to migrate for economic reasons as well as persecution. I certainly feel that people who are on the verge of starvation are, because they can't work and they can't feed their families, are suffering a form of persecution, and we should try to help to the extent that we can.
So Laura Lunn, you've dealt with a lot of these legal issues. So other than the people seeking asylum, why don't we just close our border up or get much more restrictive about who can come into the country?
Well, I think it's important to remember that the United States is a country of immigrants. We all have come here at different times. And the legality of our ability to enter the country has shifted over time. So, for somebody who says, my relatives entered lawfully at Ellis Island, your relatives entered the exact same way that people are trying to enter today. The laws have just shifted such that it's made it much more challenging. So functionally, it's the exact same behavior, and people left their homes seeking opportunity, seeking protection, and that's still true today. I think it's really important to remember that people do not leave their homes just for fun or just because they want to see what's out there in the world. It's because they're desperate, and there's nothing scarier than abandoning your whole life, your family, everything you've ever known, to seek opportunity elsewhere. But the reason that people are doing that is because they are afraid, and they need protections. And I would hope that our community would offer such protections akin to what it is we would want if we were in that situation.
Well, let's talk about a little bit how the Biden administration is handling this crisis. To what extent do we think the federal government is actually fueling this crisis? On January 5th, the administration said it would deny people from Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Haiti the chance to apply for asylum if they crossed the Mexican border without authorization between official ports of entry. Do you think, let's go to back to you, Laura. Have the Biden administration border enforcement measures rolled out this month been effective in slowing illegal crossings? What do you think about them?
I think that the problems with the bottlenecks at the border have been happening for far longer than the current administration. We saw metering happening under the Obama administration, where people were not able to cross the border and seek asylum in the way that the law intended. Obviously, Trump spent a lot of time and money trying to continue to fortify the border, but that was something that was started under the Bush administration, right? So this is a problem that's been happening for a very long time. And so President Biden is just one cog in this much larger mechanism. And bottlenecking people at the border doesn't mean that they're not going to come. It actually just creates a very violent and dangerous situation. We've seen that this large group of people who cannot enter the United States are sitting ducks for criminal organizations. The cartels have been exploiting people, have been trafficking them, have been kidnapping them, and in some instances, raping and murdering people. And so it's really important to recognize the dangers that are being created and the power that the government's policies are putting into the hands of very dangerous people. If we were able to have a flow of people going across the border akin to what we saw when Ukrainians started arriving, that would be a lot more sensible. It would be a way for us to keep tabs on who is coming and going. And so we know it is possible. It just hasn't been implemented for all kinds of political reasons.
Violetta, can you follow up on that? I wonder why is Congress so bad at immigration reform? As Laura said, this has been going on for a long time. What is the problem there?
Well, immigration is a deeply divisive issue in this country. People feel very strongly on one side as opposed to the other side. And it's been difficult for people to work together and talk together about sort of common sense, humane ways to resolve a crisis. Congress has been singularly unable to agree in order to change the laws, right? They are the branch of government that we need to be working together in order to come up with a solution to an issue like this. The president, whoever that person is, has has some authority, but limited ability to really make things happen, as we see in the immigration landscape, because it needs to be resolved legislatively. So it's really, in my opinion, a failure of our congressional members to reach consensus and move forward. The president, who right now is President Biden, is limited in the things that he can do because he's the executive and he can't change the laws. He can certainly try to change policies, and that's what the Biden administration is trying to do this month, with trying to institute a program where people from Cuba and Haiti and Nicaragua and Venezuela can apply to come through a sponsorship program, which is fairly sort of, we've seen that in the past, but we've seen it most recently with Venezuela in December, and then Ukraine. Uniting for Ukraine was a good example of the Biden administration asking the American public to take some responsibility and to help, essentially, in this crisis, and to sponsor people to come and live in the United States safely and be able to work lawfully. I do think what Laura just said is important with respect to seeing the example of how Ukrainian refugees were treated, or people fleeing Ukraine. There was a sort of a safe and orderly and humane process by which people from Ukraine were permitted to enter the United States. I think that shows us that the United States is capable of managing such a process for immigrants who show up at the border, but we're seeing a very different treatment for immigrants from other countries. And I think that this last attempt by the Biden administration to create a sponsorship program for other countries shows the administration attempting to treat people who need refuge in the same manner, and to create a more orderly system than what we're seeing at the border.
Vince, this actually goes back decades. I mean, the last real reset was amnesty under the Reagan administration. And, you know, for decades, Congress has been worrying about this. Immigrants have been made out to be the boogeyman, the reason why people can't get jobs, or criminals when Trump was in the presidency. So, you know, this has been a longstanding issue that isn't going to be solved anytime soon, I'm afraid.
So Nico, let's expand on that. But there's a huge flood happening right now, and you've reported on this. And tell me what you think are the reasons for the current flood.
I think a lot of it is what we were discussing offline before we started. When I was reporting in Southern California 10 years ago, it was largely economic reasons why the immigrants were coming. And it could be the location. A lot of them were coming from Mexico, but we are seeing you know, a wider spectrum of individuals coming from different countries that are fleeing really oppressive governments, like what we're seeing in Venezuela. And so I'm not hearing the same stories that I was 10 years ago in Southern California, that they've come for a better life, that they weren't earning much money, that there was a promise of jobs here in the US. I mean, it's those things too, but they're fleeing the cartel who was shaking them down, or the government that was pursuing them because they worked for the opposition party, and those kinds of things. So the reasons why, you know, people have always come to the US for the American dream, the better opportunity, but they're also being propelled for different reasons that are really pretty frightening.
Nico, you've reported that a majority, I believe you've written, of the immigrants coming to Denver are from Venezuela. Why is that? Why do you think we're receiving more immigrants from Venezuela?
Maduro's presidency there is in dispute. The United States doesn't recognize it. And he uses a lot of pretty manipulative tactics to keep his public in line, and one of them is food distribution. And you know, some of the migrants that we were talking about were saying that they earned just a couple of dollars a week, and eggs alone would have taken up what they earned weekly in Venezuela. You know, there's one family that I'm thinking of in particular that Carol and I interviewed. He was working for the opposition party, and his home was shot at. And so there's a lot of deeper issues that are going on besides just fleeing economic insecurity.
I'd like to shift to you, team, and talk about why these immigrants are coming to Denver. Why specifically Denver? Why are they choosing Denver? And what are you seeing on the front lines?
Thank you, Vince. I would say that there are a variety of reasons that folks are coming to Denver. We haven't been able to point to a specific reason. But one of the things that we are hoping to continue to do in Denver is just to provide shelter, basic needs, and also transportation if Denver is not a final destination. As many of you know, we are in eye-shot of I-20 on I-25 of El Paso, and then on the other side is Juarez. So in terms of a city that's further into the United States, we are a pretty direct line to our sister city, Juarez. So, you know, we're not really sure, but in terms of what we're trying to do in Denver, we're really trying to make sure that the folks that are coming here do feel like they have a place to stay, take a pause, get some shelter. It is winter time, so it is extremely cold outside. We are really trying hard not to make sure folks are just staying warm and able to catch a breath. And then if Denver's not their final destination, move on to that final destination.
Well, let's talk about a little bit this idea of Denver and Colorado as a sanctuary city and a sanctuary state. Because both the governor and the mayor of Denver has told us Colorado and Denver are not sanctuary cities or sanctuary states, but we've had other organizations tell us that they are. And certainly Colorado has passed laws that limit the cooperation between local law enforcement and federal authorities on arresting immigrants here who are here illegally. And we've also passed laws allowing immigrants who are here illegally or without documents to get driver's licenses and to get financial aid and to enroll in schools. So Ateem, do you think Denver is a sanctuary city? How would you address that question?
Honestly, I would say that like the phrase sanctuary city has been pretty politicized, and Denver, we refer to ourselves as welcoming. But do we recognize that folks put us in the label of being a sanctuary city? Absolutely. Our policies at the city are ones meant to really make sure that we are protecting our residents and that our residents feel safe. We want to make sure that our residents have access to city services. And we saw, particularly in the mid 2015, 2016, that wasn't the case. And so some of the policies that we as a city, as well as the state, have been leading on is to really try to make sure that we are, as a city, representing values that allow individuals to feel safe, to report crimes, to feel that they are not going to be separated with their children, to feel that they have a home here. And it's important. We have about 109,000 individuals who identify as immigrant and refugee in the city and county of Denver. And it's a significant number where we want to ensure that residents feel like they can have a positive and integrated life. And those policies are assisting us in doing that.
Nico, go ahead, Violetta.
Thank you, Vince. And you know, with respect to the evolution of Colorado to becoming a more welcoming state, which I think is a wonderful thing, a lot of these conversations have come, for example, with respect to law enforcement, local law enforcement, wanting to have safer communities and wanting to make sure that every member of their community feels safe to call for police help. That law enforcement has really been the drivers behind the policies that we've created here in Colorado to allow immigration officials to do their job and for local law enforcement to do their job, which are separate jobs. And to the extent that it was a safety issue in communities for immigrants to feel that local law enforcement might report them to immigration officials, local law enforcement made decisions to stop cooperating with immigration officials unless it was absolutely necessary, unless there was some warrant that was outstanding. They stopped that in order to enhance community safety. The same with respect to the driver's license bill. You know, Colorado came after several other states that had already enacted legislation to allow undocumented residents to have access to driver's license, and that was in large part to increase highway safety, right, and road safety here in Colorado. And so that was, I think, in general, sort of a net benefit to Colorado in terms of safety for all of the people who live here. And with respect to financial aid, which you also mentioned, Vince, you know, we've spent a lot of time in my clinic and here at CU Boulder working with our undocumented students who are enrolled here at CU Boulder and across the state in colleges and universities in Colorado. And none of them, even if they have DACA or deferred action for childhood arrivals, none of them have access to federal financial aid. So they struggle to pay for college. Colorado has become more welcoming in part by passing the asset bill in 2013, which allows undocumented high school graduates to pay in-state tuition to go to school here in Colorado if they can meet the residency requirements. And one thing that has happened along the way as well is increasing access to state financial aid for those undocumented students. So all of that, I think, are common sense policies that Colorado has made in order to make sure that all of their residents have access to our sort of basic services here in the country, here in the state.
Well, let's talk about those services a little bit, a team. We've read reports from Nico that the whole system in Denver is at a breaking point, that these new numbers of immigrants have really upped costs and put pressures on the city. And I know that nonprofits and the faith community have stepped up. I wonder if you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, and just for everyone's awareness, we have served over the last couple of days as of approximately 4,200 individuals. And currently we have just under 1,000 individuals in a variety of city shelters. And so in terms of the ability for the city to continue, we have done just the best that we can in terms of what we've been able to provide with the resources, but it is a challenge. We spent approximately 5.2 million, and these numbers will continue to fluctuate. So it's an estimate. But those are definitely constraints that we try to and will continue to grapple with on a daily basis. And so our partnerships with our community-based organizations, our nonprofit, our faith communities has been extremely important, vital to the success of not only what we are currently responding to, but in the future. And so our nonprofit partners have and faith communities have opened up their doors to provide temporary shelter for individuals coming and normally those who were traveling on to a final destination. But there has been a good number of faith communities and organizations that have done that upwards of a length of 7 to 10 days. And then we have our nonprofit partners. We've got Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network and other legal service providers who are attending what we are referring to as community resource sites. And these are in partnership with our Denver Public Library, where our migrants who are planning on staying in the Denver metro area are able to access resources, understanding their legal rights, understanding the legal pathways that they have to apply for asylum. And then we also have individuals, nonprofits who are just helping our migrant newcomers connect to Denver and Denver metro area resources, community resource navigation. And so there's definitely a lot of partners who are working to help those who want to remain in Denver feel that they have a path towards that integration on the Denver level as well as the Colorado level. We are really striving to make sure that integration is a holistic approach. And so trying to address all needs. And then for those who are traveling on to other final destinations, we are also trying to work with other organizations to inform those individuals what the networks are, who they might connect with when they get to their final destination.
Laura, let me ask you a question related to this that comes from one of our viewers. So is this sanctuary label and this welcoming posture of Denver and Colorado's, Is that encouraging more people to come here and creating more problems?
It's important to recognize that migrant flows are happening across the country every day. We might have seen a large uptick of people that the city of Denver and the state of Colorado have done an amazing job helping to support in the past couple of months. But that's an anomaly only in that the folks arrived all at once on buses. It certainly is not an anomaly in terms of the flow of migrants coming into the United States. And I want to make sure that we're drilling down on one thing. It is lawful for people to seek asylum in the United States. It is lawful, regardless of their manner of entry, for them to be able to have a day in court, to have the access to fair adjudication process. What we're talking about is not just opening the borders to everybody, though I personally think that that would be a great idea. What we're talking about is making sure people have access to the judicial system that exists and having access to fairness, such that they can present their cases and have a judge weigh on whether or not they meet the legal standard that Violetta was talking about in terms of who qualifies for asylum. And I just want to recognize that people with attorneys are 10 times more likely to win their cases. The city of Denver and the state of Colorado have, in addition to the plethora of other initiatives that Violetta mentioned, have invested money in legal defense funds to ensure that non-citizens have access to counsel. It's a drop in the bucket in terms of the need, but it's also important to recognize we're not just talking about newly arriving folks when we're talking about the immigration system and this process. We're talking about people who've been living in the state of Colorado for decades. I actually just won a case yesterday where the client entered the United States in the early 70s and has 5 US citizen children and a US citizen spouse. So we're not just talking about people knocking on the door today. We're talking about people who've been intertwined in our communities, who work alongside us, whose kids go to our kids' schools. And it's really important to recognize the humanity of people and to treat them as if they were your neighbor, because they are.
Can you help explain a little bit, Laura, what the difference is between the rights of immigrants who cross without authorization and those who are here lawfully? Can you explain that a little bit so our viewers understand?
Well, the short answer is immigration law is incredibly complicated. For me to adequately answer that question would take far longer than anybody would ever want to listen to me talk for. But I will say it does not matter if you present yourself to an immigration official at a port of entry, or if you walk across the border and encounter an immigration official within 5 or 10 miles of the border, or within 100 miles of the border, you have a right to seek asylum, regardless of the manner of entry. And it's incredibly important that people understand that. And I know we were talking about this large mass of people at the southern border right now, which is the result of the policies that have slowed down the processing of asylum cases. And I can't tell you how many times I've served clients who have said, oh my gosh, if I had known, I would have gone to a port of entry and presented myself. They were smuggled across the border by cartel members who are making a lot of money off of people who are telling them, oh, this is the way that you have to enter the United States. And so people are being put in really awful situations where they don't have control over their autonomy and are not necessarily even able to present themselves because of the strength of the cartels at the border. And we can't treat this as a vacuum, as if like an individual person is making a choice that doesn't follow the letter of the law, because quite frankly, people don't know what the laws are in the United States, and they're being told information that is misleading, that is causing all kinds of problems for the US government's ability to regulate the border. But that is not because they're trying to sneak across the border and do anything nefarious. It's truly because people are in desperate situations and are trying to access the systems that we have in place to protect them.
Nico, I wonder if you could pivot to talk about some of the reporting you've done on how Colorado is shuttling some of these immigrants to other states and the controversy over that and why that's happening, if it's related to Colorado just being at a breaking point in being able to handle the immigrants that are coming here.
Well, if you recall, shortly before Christmas, we had that sub-zero Arctic blast that came through. And my understanding from the reporting is, well, listen, I was held up in my house for like 3 days. I didn't go outside. But it's obviously very dangerous for the homeless population, and migrants were still coming. This was before the U.S. Supreme Court, stayed the decision to lift to Title 42. And we don't expect a decision probably until really the end of their term. But anyway, so there was this huge backlog, about 1,800 immigrants when we'd been averaging 1,000 or less. And so the governor stepped in to help what Denver was already doing, which was getting immigrants to their desired location. Now, to the critical eye, it looks the same as what Texas did or what Florida did. The difference is the migrants, for example, that DeSantis, the Florida governor, shipped up to Martha's Vineyard, didn't have a choice of where they were going. And so by all accounts, my understanding is that the immigrants that are coming here to Denver are saying, listen, I'm headed to Washington, D.C., or I'm headed to Chicago or somewhere else. And the city was helping them at best to get there. The migrants that we were talking to are coming with very little. I mean, I asked them, how much money do you have in your pocket right now? And one of them pulled out a $5 bill, and another couple pulled out a single $1 bill. So, for them to get anywhere, they're going to need assistance. And the Denver and the state was helping with that. Of course, the criticism of Polis became from other Democratic mayors, hey, don't ship them here, because really cities across the nation are feeling the strain. We've just only begun to feel it in a very public way with that first bus of roughly 90 or 100 immigrants that came in early December. So in a nutshell.
I think the reason too, Vince, is that, people are going to go where their community is, right? And so if there is a larger group of community members like them that speak their same language, that perhaps eat the same food, that worship the same God, they're going to try to find them and find some refuge in that particular community. We here in the clinic at CU, we represented last semester 2 young men from Ukraine who had been sponsored by a middle school teacher up in Fort Collins, Colorado. And these 2 young men, they were both in their mid-20s from Ukraine, stayed in Fort Collins, Colorado as long as they could. And then they made their way to New York because they wanted to find other Ukrainians. They wanted to find the community. They wanted to be more engaged than they could be here in Fort Collins. They didn't have anyone to talk to here that spoke their language. And so they left to find their community. So I can see that just makes sense, right? Like from a human perspective, that people would want to find their community. And that's why you see people sort of coming through Colorado, but not necessarily staying.
Violetta, let me follow up. We've got a question from a viewer about the asylum process itself. How long does it usually take? Who gets denied? Who gets accepted? What should the immigrants be prepared for? What docs or evidence do they need? I know you can go into a lot of detail here, but I wonder if you could give us an overview of the process of somebody coming to Denver, what they have to go through.
So the asylum process in the immigration system in general is famously backlogged, and it can take many, many years to find to reach the sort of final outcome of your case. So it varies from person to person. It's important to know that there are 2 ways to apply for asylum. You can apply for asylum affirmatively to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services if you arrive in the United States and you're not placed in removal proceedings. Or you can apply for asylum defensively, which means that you are actually in removal proceedings and you may have to litigate your case in court and make your asylum claim to a judge. We've litigated a few asylum cases in the clinic, and one of them took 7 years and the other one took 3.5 years. They were both defensive asylum claims, so we were in court. And the evidence that we needed to prove we were successful in both was to show that there had been past persecution in the country where the asylum seeker was coming from, and to provide evidence of that. You know, and the evidence can look very different depending on the person and what the persecution is that they suffered, as well as country conditions evidence, in order to show that that country cannot, or that the government of that country cannot protect the asylum seeker should they return. So they tend to be very sort of evidence-heavy cases. Laura mentioned before that it's very difficult for immigrants to have access to attorneys. Those that do have access to attorneys are much more likely to win their case and be successful. You know, I started off as a public defender in the criminal system. I wish and I hope, and my deepest dream is that there will one day here in the United States exist a public defender for immigrants, where we provide lawyers to immigrants who are appearing and asking for benefits that they have the right to ask for under our current laws. A lot of people, unfortunately, have to make these asylum requests without lawyers because immigration lawyers are expensive, and there are not a lot of free lawyers. And so the asylum process can be very lengthy, it can be very complicated. And in the end, you know, those people who don't have access to lawyers are not always successful at all in order to claim asylum, because it is a fairly high bar in order to win those cases.
Thank you,
And just
Violetta.
something in there, you know, because the Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network, essentially, we are public defenders for non-citizens. Our clients do not have to pay money for our legal services. But I think I mentioned earlier that nevertheless, about 70% of people in immigration proceedings here in Colorado don't have access to counsel because there's just not enough resources. And I just want to echo what Violetta was saying in terms of how complicated this process is, and how each one of us kind of smirks when you ask how long does it take to apply for asylum, because it really varies. You know, we represent people in detention in Aurora. Those cases move very, very quickly when people are detained. And so they might have resolution in, 6 to 9 months before the immigration court. But that doesn't mean the cases wrap up in that amount of time, because you have to think through the appellate process as well. And so we have clients detained for years who have no criminal history necessarily, and they're just seeking asylum here in the United States. And we have at least one case, I was just talking to another attorney in our office, where the client's case has been pending for 12 years before the Denver immigration court, and they still don't have any resolution. And so just echoing what Violetta was saying in terms of how much it varies. And like I said, you can be 10 times more likely to prevail in your immigration matters if you have an attorney. And that's really significant when what we're talking about is people being deported to countries where they are afraid for their lives and where they are fearful that they will be murdered. So the stakes are incredibly high, and we need to treat them as such when we're considering what resources people should have access to when litigating these cases.
Thank you, Laura. Team, let me pivot to a question from our viewership about costs. You know, how do you balance the needs of Americans and current residents, including the homeless in Denver, and the immigrants who are arriving here? Our resources are not infinite. How do you think the city should allocate those resources, and are they allocated fairly?
That's definitely a tough question, but a really good question, and I appreciate that. I think that, we are, this particular increase of individuals coming to Denver has prompted the Denver to initiate what's called the Emergency Operations Center, because this is an actual emergency. I recognize that our people experiencing homelessness is an issue that we have a whole department, the Department of Housing Stability, that's working to address those issues and really to address how we can work to get more folks into actual housing and not just into shelters. And so I would definitely say that it's a challenge to balance these very real situations that are coming to our door. The city is trying to work, collaboratively with philanthropic partners, but also with the state. We've been able to ask the state for some funding, excuse me, that has allowed us to balance the challenges that that have been raised, and we'll continue to try to deal with them the best that we can, but it is a balance. We, like I said before, we are a welcoming city and we have policies that stand by those values. And so we'll continue to work to balance all of the needs of our residents. And it shouldn't be, I do want to make sure that folks understand we are responding to an emergency at this point, and we recognize and we fully understand that we have residents here who also are impacted by challenges. And so we are really working to try to balance those needs. But that is also why we've been asking the federal government for support. And we'll continue to ask the federal government and Congress to pass laws and to pass processes that will actually assist us in helping all individuals who come to Denver to make Denver their residence.
Let me ask a follow-up, Ateem. What can you expect in terms of city services if an immigrant shows up here? What about health insurance, things like that? That's another question from our viewers.
So it's important to understand that there are not an infinite amount of benefits that are available to all. Federal dollars really dictate that you have to have a particular lawful status in order to receive specific benefits. So I think it is important that the viewers understand not everyone gets all types of benefits. But in terms of in the city and county of Denver, at the very minimum, we want to offer basic needs, so food and shelter. For folks who plan to stay in Denver, there are a number of local benefits and some state benefits that allow individuals without lawful status to access. I believe just this year, healthcare in the state of Colorado has become available for folks who don't have lawful status. But there is not just this array of benefits that are available to individuals. So the challenges are very real for our undocumented community members who don't have access to federally funded public benefits. And so that is where our nonprofit partners and where our philanthropic donors and partners also come into play.
I think
you,
it might be
Ateem.
something just to inject here, if I can, really quickly, is
Thank you.
that immigrants are coming from Venezuela. They don't have healthcare like we have healthcare here. So I don't think that there's this expectation to come and sup off the government for these benefits. In fact, when I was in Southern California, the immigrants would line up for blocks and blocks and blocks when Doctors Without Borders would come to Southern California to service the immigrant communities there. My experience has been that, a lot of them wait way too long to seek any kind of healthcare because they know that that's not available to them here. So, while certainly there are probably those that are trying to, as Americans are, to milk whatever system they can. My experience has been with the immigrants that I've dealt with that they're hardworking and they come for a job, and the benefits, based on a study that I did in Southern California, really outweigh the costs. There are costs associated with immigrants coming, obviously, but once they get jobs and are a part of the economy, the benefits outweigh the costs.
So Laura and Violetta, maybe you can address this. We're getting a lot of questions about why aren't we prioritizing people who are trying to be legal immigrants and follow the law get their papers in order. Why aren't they a priority? Why aren't we trying to clean up the backlog of legal immigrants first? Laura, do you want to address that?
Sure. I think what we've been trying to explain is that we are, right?
Yep.
It is legal to seek asylum in the United States. And people who are seeking asylum are just adding to the flow of cases that are going through the immigration system. They're not necessarily jumping the line unless the federal government creates a policy that forces them to expedite their cases. And so we're not talking about only asylum seekers in the immigration system. Everybody is knocking on the door and seeking protections from the systems that we have in place, and it's not one or the other.
Violetta, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, so U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services is the arm of our immigration sort of realm that deals with people who are trying to adjust their status lawfully within the United States, and then to also arrive on what we call non-immigrant visas. So people that are going to be here temporarily, either as temporary workers or as students or as tourists. USCIS has been dealing with a backlog of these sort of lawful visa requests for a very long time. So non-immigrant visas, as well as visas from within the United States that would change the status of people who are going to remain here indefinitely and become immigrants that live here in the United States. So USCIS has been dealing for years with a backlog. They are attempting to address it. And these are sort of what are the sort of typical ways that people can lawfully access our immigration system. Like Laura said, everyone who comes in and asks for asylum is doing so because we allow it lawfully. It is a lawful manner to remain here in the United States. And so we're dealing with an already burdened immigration system that doesn't have enough employees, according to USCIS as well. They're also dealing with a labor shortage that we're seeing all across the country. And they're trying to address the backlog of issues coming in. I mean, but sort of, I think that the bigger answer to that is that our immigration laws are really restrictive, and there are very few ways in which people can both arrive lawfully and remain lawfully in the United States, which is why we have about 11 million undocumented people living in the United States at any given time for the last, over a decade that has been happening. And that's because there are few paths for people that have been here for a long time. Like the fact that someone who arrived in 1973 still has not managed to get lawful access to our system shows how restrictive we are. And so managing sort of the large number of people that exist here in the United States that don't have a lawful access to remain here lawfully in the United States is challenging for sure, as we try to navigate also people who are accessing the system in a lawful manner. And we do have ways in which that can happen.
Team, maybe you can address this question. If immigrants end up in our hospital systems without insurance, that raises the insurance costs for everybody, doesn't it? And who pays for that?
I'm not really knowledgeable on insurance, so I can't really say who fronts the costs on insurance and how insurance navigates whether they raise rates or not.
Anybody else have any perspective on that question? Let me mention here, we did invite law enforcement and ICE to participate in our webinar today, but since they are actively, involved in cases that they can't speak about, they declined to join in with us. So, there are issues about costs. There's Representative Lamborn in Colorado Springs has worried about immigrants coming to Colorado taking jobs, increasing our crime rates, which have, skyrocketed in the last couple of years. Ateem, do you have any thoughts about, are you seeing a lot of crime among the immigrants that are coming to Denver? Is that an issue for you?
I think it's important to recognize our local law enforcement officers and agencies do their job really well. We don't tolerate individuals who break the law. And that's their job. Our local law enforcement will continue to do their job. They will continue to uphold the laws. And if people in the city and county of Denver break the law, you will be prosecuted, arrested. Those functions do not go away because we have immigrants and refugees that live in our city and county of Denver. And I do think it's important to note that. In terms of whether there's an increase in crime directly related to immigrant and refugee communities, I would say no. Denver has definitely, we'll just continue to deal with the crimes and the challenges of crime, but I would definitely want to make sure that folks understand our local law enforcement will continue to do their jobs. We don't allow individuals to get a pass because they are from a different country. The laws of the city and county of Denver are just that, and we ask everyone to abide by them. And if they don't, you will be prosecuted, arrested. Those rules don't change.
I'll say too, these are things that have been said for many, many years about immigrants by people trying to, I think, just spread fear and misinformation in our country. The Pew Research Institute has done a lot of really good studies about crime with respect to immigrants, and they have found across the board that immigrants commit less crime than US-born native citizens. And so that argument that immigrants bring crime or increase crime is not true and has been factually debunked by many times over the last few decades. And it may be something that people don't want to hear, but it is true. And so with respect to the other piece that you mentioned, Vince, which I didn't write down, but it was just concerns, about taking jobs, right? That's been another thing that we've heard for many, many years about immigrants coming here and taking jobs. The reality is that America in general, and Colorado is not immune from this, is experiencing an extraordinary labor shortage. And we actually need people to work. We need more people to apply for the jobs that we have open. And to the extent that the Biden administration is trying to institute this parole policy, which is really new, or the sponsorship policy, that would actually allow people to work lawfully, and we would know who are here in the United States, and it would be a way to try to address this national labor shortage, which we've been under for a long time. So I think that in general, we have thought about this and talked about this for many, many years, and people who are not partisan, right, who are trying to really evaluate what the truth to these claims are, have evaluated these and found that immigrants do not increase crime, and that to the extent that we need workers, immigrants are often a wonderful source for that.
Nico, I wonder if you could address one more question, then we'll go around the room for some final thoughts. Right now, fewer immigrants have arrived in the last few days, you've reported. Do we think that trend will continue, or do you expect to see the situation escalate again from what your reporting shows?
I think immigrant groups, and I talked to some in El Paso, Texas, are all pointing to Title 42. And it would appear that certainly not all, but many of those that had been coming in the latter part of the year were anticipating Title 42 being lifted. Now that it's stayed, Supreme Court's going to hear arguments next month on this, and we don't expect probably a response until the end of their term, which would probably be sometime in June, and then we could probably very likely see this build up again. So
do you think what happens when Title 42 does expire and the COVID emergency is over?
Well, it lifts it lifts the statute that Title 42 is the statute that was for this, for COVID-19. I mean, that was all put in place to, limit the crossings and whatnot, and to spread the disease of COVID-19. So once that's lifted, then those restrictions that Violetta and Laura were talking about regarding individuals seeking asylum are supposed to be lifted. So
Thank you. All right, let's go up to the last thoughts if we can, because we're almost out of time. We have about 5 minutes left. Violetta, I wonder if we could start with you. Any general thoughts about our discussion or things you'd like to say in sum?
Well, I mean, again, like I said at the beginning, I think this is a very challenging topic. People feel very strongly about it. And I would encourage us all to continue to try to have these conversations. And I appreciate you, Vince and Luigi, for creating this space for us to be able to talk about some of these difficult issues. I think that if we can all agree on basic values, which are that we want to treat everybody like we would want to be treated should we need that help, then I think that we can start from a space that is kinder and more humane. And I'm happy to be living in Colorado, which I think is a state, like a team said, is a welcoming state. There's absolutely nothing wrong with being a welcoming state, and I'm glad that I'm here.
Thank you, and thanks for joining us today. Team, do you want to jump in with a few closing thoughts?
Yeah, I want to honestly appreciate the City and County of Denver employees and also the nonprofit partners that we've had. This is an opportunity for me to just express just how hard folks have been working to address this particular response, but honestly also just the values that it expresses for us as a city and county, but also as a state of Colorado, to how we want to help a variety of individuals. Right now, we're assisting migrants. We are also assisting people experiencing homelessness, and just knowing that there are individuals who desire to build better communities, build stronger communities that include as many as we can. I am also proud to work in the City and County of Denver and to live here as well. So thank you all for your time and welcome the continued conversation.
Thanks for joining us, team. Laura, do you have some closing thoughts?
I just want to thank this group. I've learned things from each one of you during this discussion, and I think it's really important for us to continue having these discussions so that we can better understand this thorny issue that, you know, is so divisive and people feel very strongly about it. But ultimately, I personally feel really fortunate to live in a place where our government has embodied the values that I think are so important, and that is treating people with dignity and respect and making sure that they feel welcomed and supported. Because if I were in a situation where I had to abandon my whole life, I would hope that others would treat me similarly.
Thank you, Laura, and thanks for being here. All right, Nico, why don't you bring us home with your thoughts about our conversation today?
Well, I really appreciate everyone on the panel. I'll echo what Laura said. I took several notes on some of the things you said. I think any one of them could be its own follow-up story. I mean, having lived in border states in Texas and California before, I think, you know, our proximity to the border is not around the corner. And I think it took a lot of Denverites by surprise, the numbers that were coming. But El Paso had been seeing 1,500 a day. And New York City, since April of last year, had seen more than 30,000 come. So the 4,000 roughly that have come here, that the mayor said is really, you know, straining us. And I believe that it is. I think it's just indicative of, you know, how widespread what happens at the border more than 600 miles away can impact us here in Denver. And we'll probably continue to do so, especially as the court looks at Title 42.
Thank you very much, Nico. And thank you all for being here for this thoughtful discussion. I appreciate you taking the time. And thanks to our viewers for jumping in and giving us your questions and interest and attention. It is an important issue, very complex. Thank you all.